The 17th century iatrochemist Michael Maier has attracted considerable attention over the last years. His emblem work Atalanta Fugiens, which is particularly famous for the beautiful illustrations, has just recently been edited as a digital edition called Furnace and Fugue. Yet Maier's works are mentioned very often, but studied very little in detail, as some scholars have complained. This has caused research on Maier to be highly dependent on secondary literature, which is in part quite outdated. With ongoing digitization and projects such as Verzeichnis deutscher Drucke, for example, lots of digital facsimiles of these early modern texts become available online. For computational analysis, however, we need the digital text to be transcribed. For this, the transcriber software provides an easy solution. For example, the model created in the Innsbruck Noscemus project allows us to easily transcribe early modern Latin print. In this talk, I'd like to argue that with the availability of digital texts, we are able to computationally analyze these texts and especially decode alchemical decknamen with the use of machine reasoning algorithms. Language is a central aspect in what makes alchemy so secretive and riddled, yet there is no comprehensive study of alchemical language this far. There are some theories, like Umberto Eco's theory of hermetic semiosis, which are very theoretical. They cannot be applied to a digital analysis. Most of them can't even be applied to sources other than those on which the theories were based. It is problematic to speak of one alchemy when there are, in fact, several periods, we could say several alchemies. However, if there is one thing which unites all of these alchemies, then it is alchemical language. Language has been an important part in the new historiography of alchemy, the research tradition pioneered by William Newman and Lawrence Principe, in which they have read alchemical texts chemically and recreated those chemical experiments in a laboratory, thus verifying their interpretations of the texts. The new historiography and works by William Newman especially have provided us with some vocabulary to even address the phenomena of alchemical language. I want to mention just a few, notably decknamen, that is, cover names where, for example, we use the name of a mythological figure to denote a chemical agent, or other stylistic devices such as dispersion of knowledge, that is, stopping to talk about one topic in a place, and then the user of the book has to look in another part of the book using signal words to find where the text goes on, or even the phenomenon called parathesis by William Newman, in which we see a heaping up of decknamen, meaning, for example, Saturnus, Mercurius, Apollo, etc., in order to confuse an unworthy reader who does not know how to chemically decode these phenomena. Oftentimes we wonder, why did alchemists encode their texts like this? The alchemists and chemists themselves have often explained that it is to exclude the unworthy, or, for example, to create a community of experts. Only those experts who know how to decode this language can rightly call themselves chemists and can perform the chemical experiments coded behind the text. But this playful rhetoric of secrecy can also be a means of self-fashioning. For example, sometimes we see that alchemists use decknamen and elaborate allegories to refer to theories which aren't even all that important to the point that they're making. One could say that this is mostly to show off how well versed they were in using this language and thus qualify themselves as an authority, as an alchemical expert. But apart from this means of authorizing the competence of the alchemists themselves, the alchemical language can also be a useful means of communication of chemical phenomena at a time where quantitative analysis was not yet possible. Alchemists used this flowery language to communicate their experiences during experiments, and other practitioners who had made the same experiences could then relate them back to what the chemical processes were. I don't want to go into the details of the history of research and state of the art on alchemical language here. I just mentioned Umberto Eco and the new historiography of alchemy, but I want to talk about two phenomena which I think are also related to major developments and shifts in how historians of science refer to this period, which have not yet been taken into account in the interpretation of alchemical language. For a long time, the discussion of the so-called scientific revolution wanted to create a rupture between veiled language and the open language of what then would go on to be accepted as a science. Recent research has shown that this was more like an ongoing process in which even the chemists, who themselves proclaimed that alchemical language had to be abandoned, were actively involved in. In alchemists such as Robert Boyle, we can see that he both claimed we needed to get rid of alchemical language, but also used alchemical language himself, and masterfully so. Another problem with the research so far has been that this so-called scientific revolution has mostly been pinpointed on certain individuals, such as the aforementioned Boyle or Andreas Libavius, who himself wasn't even actually a chemical practitioner. Furthermore, recent discussions, for example by Kuhn-Vermeer, have shown that this supposed dichotomy between secrecy and openness cannot be maintained any longer, and that secrecy often was also a very practical element which was necessary in scientific publication. For example, to ensure the priority of knowledge in book publication. The role of a rhetoric of secrecy has also been discussed in the context of the so-called economy of secrets and entrepreneurial alchemy, which focused mostly on the fact that in the alchemical self-fashioning, it was necessary for practitioners to show off their skills, also maybe even to perform their skills also by means of veiled language, in order to attract the interest of their patrons, which would then go on to fund their research. Secondly, and more specifically to alchemy, we have to take into account the findings of this so-called new historiography of alchemy. As I've said before, lots of studies on alchemical language and lots of theories, such as Umberto Eco's, have relied on this idea of a hermetic semiosis, on the assumption of a spiritual alchemy, which, as Newman and Principe mostly have been able to show, was just not a historical reality. However, alchemical language has never been re-investigated in a full manner in the context of these new findings. This is why I'm hoping that a digital approach can help promote the new historiography in the analysis of alchemical language and alchemical denknamen. As I've mentioned before, the new historiography of alchemy has provided us with a terminology to adequately talk about the phenomena of alchemical language. This is an important first step, but it has also provided us with a methodology to interpret these denknamen, which, if we break it down, it's a proof of coherence in which we read the texts chemically and then experiment in the laboratory, and success in the laboratory will then essentially prove the coherence of the historical interpretation. I argue that such a proof of coherence can also be achieved via digital methods. The advantage of this would be that it's far less costly and no chemical expertise is required at all stages of the process. This would allow us especially to easily gain knowledge about easier parts or maybe even less interesting parts of texts without the help of a chemist. In his theory on alchemical language, Michel Butor has contributed a very interesting idea, and that is that the most typical aspect of alchemical language is that its denknamen change their meaning by context, meaning they're not arbitrary, but the meaning will be consistent with the context. Incidentally, there is a similar principle in computer linguistics. It's called keyword in context, also referred to as QUIC, in which we determine the meaning of a word by analyzing its linguistic context. For example, that could mean that we look at the 5 words surrounding one word to determine its meaning. The keyword in context is essentially a form of concordancing. I argue that we could generate a context of Decknamen to determine the meaning of an alchemical Deckname, or at least provide a probability count how likely it is that it's referring to, for example, a chemical agent or rather a philosophical principle. While in computer linguistics, the keyword in context uses just very few words surrounding a concept, in my context of Decknamen, I would argue we use digital annotation to track Decknamen around a Deckname and then take all of those into account. For example, 7 Decknamen before the word and 7 after. This is considerably longer than a traditional keyword in context, but I think it is necessary to really understand the meaning and to track the change of context in alchemical Decknamen. So once we have tracked these words, how can a computer use machine reasoning to find out what context to attribute? In order for this to be possible, I argue that we could use RDF, that's the Resource Description Framework, a way of storing knowledge digitally in order to keep track of contexts that a word can have. For example, let's take mercurius. This is a very ambiguous concept in alchemy. It can have a variety of meanings, and notably it can be both the philosophical principle and the chemical mercury, quicksilver. Mercurius can have the context of being a mythological figure. I would call this the context mythological. It could have the chemical context when it's referring to mercury. That's what I would call the context chemical. Then it can also be a planet. Then, in case of mercurius, we have to take one other aspect into account, and that is that at the time Michael Maier, for example, was writing, the differentiation between what is history and what is mythology was a bit different to ours nowadays. So for Michael Maier, sometimes mercurius also refers to Hermes, meaning Hermes Trismegistus, whom he considered to be a historical figure. This would be context historical. To show you how such an example of distributional semantics could work and what we can achieve with it, how it will help us decode alchemical Decknamen, I want to talk about an example taken from Michael Maier's Viatorium. Michael Maier was a 17th century German iatrochemist. He was born in 1568 and died in 1622. So between 1614 and his death in 1622, he published a plethora of books, sometimes 5 books in one year. And the work that I'm going to talk about, his Viatorium, was published in 1618. The Viatorium is a fairly chemical tract, as opposed to, for example, Maier's emblems, which are very, very mythological in nature. However, it is in the Viatorium that we can also see this interesting rhetoric of secrecy at play. The book opens with a poem, and in this poem Maier states that he will not fool the reader with dubious expressions. However, in the introduction, Maier follows up with a mythological allegory showing what will happen to those who spill alchemical secrets, and it is full of warnings and admonitions not to spill the alchemical secrets. This could seem contradictory, but I argue that it's just part of a performative rhetoric of secrecy by which Maier authorizes himself as an alchemical expert. He is essentially just showing off his skills and showing that he masters this language of secrecy and that he can use mythological allegories to prove his point, to beautify what he is saying as well. This sort of self-fashioning is very common at the period, and Michael Maier thinks of himself as a poeta laureatus, a poet laureate, who has been honored for his poetic skills essentially, and he's very proud of them, as he shows in many of his works. In the rest of the book, then again, Maier writes in completely open style. He begins with a chapter on Mercurius and ensues with a chapter on Saturnus. In the introduction of this chapter, Maier makes it very clear what he is talking about. He says, here when I say Saturnus, I don't mean the planet. I don't mean the mythological figure. I mean the metal. I'm going to read you the translation By Saturnus, I mean here neither the outmost planet of the universe nor the pagan god, so to say the forefather and first founder, about whom I talked about enough in his place in my hieroglyphics, but the metallic substance which is called by the name of lead and its minerals, like it is commonly understood. By his hieroglyphics he means the Arcana Arcanissima, his work on mytho-alchemy. Then the chapter continues, he talks about the current theories on Saturnus and how it can be used in alchemical processes. But towards the end of the chapter, there is a beautiful image followed by an allegory, and it's the allegory of the dragon's blood. In this allegory, we find the phenomenon of Decknamen and of parathesis, that is the heaping up of Decknamen to confuse a reader. The story begins like this. The elephant goes to a waterhole. Maier explains it that the elephant drinks so much that he's really saturated. This shows us it's a language that's not so well suited for an actual elephant. It shows us that this is about a chemical process. He says that the elephant comes back from this waterhole completely saturated. But there is a snake or a dragon, Draco, lying in the weeds around this waterhole, waiting for the elephant to cross its path so it can attack. And it does so. It bites the elephant starts to die as the snake drinks all of its blood. So the snake too is now saturated with blood and also saturated with the water or the liquid that the elephant had before been saturated with. And now the snake didn't really calculate what it was doing, because obviously the elephant is much bigger than the snake, and the elephant is now about to die and to topple over and essentially squash the snake. And this is what happens. And Maier wants to say now that what the alchemists have understood as the blood of the snake is actually the blood of the elephant, because as the snake is squashed by the weight of the elephant, it spits out the blood again, but it's not the snake's blood, it's the elephant's blood. At the end, there is one sentence where Maier starts his parathesis, the heaping up of Decknamen, to now confuse the reader again, to whom he had just explained what, to his mind, this dragon's blood means. Its blood is then called dragon's blood, even though it is rather part of the elephant, quite useful to medicine and other necessities of humankind. This snake, whose blood is taken as philosophical medicine, needs to be properly understood. That is, not as something earthly taken from the ground, so that it is not wrongly substituted. It is of the kind which is attributed to Saturn, to Apollo, to Aesculapius and Mercurius. It is that which killed Cadmus's comrades and was killed by him, which guarded the golden fleece and the apples from the garden of the Hesperides. So as you can see here, there is a plethora of mythological names. And he just says, it is the same thing as, etc., etc., etc. But he's not saying what these things have in common. So to explain what Maier means by this parathesis, I want to remind you of some of the mythological connections which are at play here. He says, it is attributed to Saturn. The attribute of Saturn is a snake. To Apollo, because Apollo is said to have slayed a huge serpent called Python. To Aesculapius, because we know that the rod of Aesculapius, which is often used as a symbol for medicine, he has one snake. And Mercurius, who also has his staff, the Caduceus. And then he also mentions the dragon who killed Cadmus's comrades and was killed by Cadmus. And then also the snake dragon, which guarded the garden of the Hesperides. This is also very important because this story, then again, is the central piece of his Atalanta Fugiens. So we can already see that very likely what Maier is talking about, he's just repeating the snake connection. But for a reader who doesn't know these things, this would be very confusing and they might doubt that they got it right. Also, this could be a case of the dispersion of knowledge. That's another alchemical stylistic device to defer meaning to other parts of the book. So you would have to look for a signal word in another place of the book, or in case of Maier, because he published so much, in another book entirely. We know that earlier he referred to his Arcana Arcanissima for information on the mythological aspects. So in this case, he's enumerating these aspects and very likely wants us to look at which meanings he attributed to these gods in order to have a more full picture of how he understands this dragon and its significance. So if you're not particularly firm in mythology, the connection might escape you. However, a computer can store lots and lots of knowledge. So my digital method can be used in two contexts on these alchemical texts. On the one hand, it can provide you with a probability count which context we're currently in. Are we in a rather chemical context, or maybe is it purely mythological? On the other hand, it will help us identify common properties, shared properties of the concepts that are currently mentioned in the text. That will help us, for example, like in the allegory of the dragon's blood, it will show us that the common denominator between all of those gods and mythological figures mentioned is in fact the Draco. Before we can apply my method, we need to have our text in digital form, and we need to have the context of decknamen, we need to have those decknamen annotated digitally. This is a simplified version of what it would really look like, but just so you can get an idea. So we now have this text part that I just discussed in meaning with the parathesis, the heaping up of decknamen. And for example, we have Apollo and Aesculapius and Mercurius. And we annotate all those, so we make them essentially findable for the computer. And then the computer will have a way of knowing which contexts are currently possible. So it would essentially note down, okay, one for mythological actor, one for historical actor, one for chemical, and one for planet. This is in a way simplified, of course, because a planet gets also counted as very likely chemical. There are certain rules for the machine reasoning to follow, which I will not go into detail. But in the end, we show that context chemical is dominant in one part and context mythological becomes hugely dominant in the other part. So we now know that likely something is going on. Either it's just a mythological allegory meant to beautify, or there's something that we're missing. This is where machine reasoning can also help us. It can show us, for example, what are common denominators between those mythological elements. And I will show you now the RDF triples. So RDF, the Resource Description Framework, is a way of coding knowledge in simple subject, verb, object triples. So it will say, for example, Mercurius is a planet, and planet has context planets. Then Mercurius is a chemical agent. Chemical agent has context chemical. This is in fact very simple and not necessarily what we would consider knowledge in a humanities context, but in information science, in computer science, the knowledge that a computer can understand is really quite simplistic. But this is still enough to draw meaningful conclusions. For example, we can see that first the chemical context or the allegorical one is dominant and then the mythological is. In the end, this will just be a count that shows us a probability. And the other triples show connections between those items. For example, Apollo has a story that involves a Draco, a snake. Then we have the one where it says Aesculapius has the attribute that is a rod with the snakes. And that way we can ask the computer, what are the common properties? That will give us, in this case, a quite clear result that they all have a Draco, a snake, in common. Now that we know what this parathesis means, we can then go on to look up, for example, is there another Mercurius mentioned in the context of a snake in Michael's other books? So can we find other information? Does he mean for us to search for signals in his other books? It might or might not be the case. Maybe in the case of some of them, maybe in the case of none of them. But the digital methods also allows us to concordance really quickly, so to get an overview of relevant passages of text, which might include this information. If we had to do this by hand, this would be a lot of work, and a computer can just do it in seconds. The digital method that I provided is on the one hand a method for the analysis of these decknamen, But I also provide the whole methodology so other people can easily apply this to their own text and create their own basis of knowledge. I'm happy to contribute my skills as a digital classicist to the research of history of science and the history of alchemy, and to further promote the methodologies put forth by William Newman and Lawrence Principe for the analysis of alchemical texts and alchemical decknamen by making them more widely accessible to users who might not be experts in, for example, mythology, but the same thing could of course be done as well with chemical agents or chemical processes, reactions, etc. So you could encode any kind of knowledge that you want in the system and make it accessible to users who might not have this knowledge. My digital algorithm was devised in a way that it can be easily applied to other texts which are available as digital texts. So in case you have a facsimile, you need to first transcribe it, but then this method can also be applied. I thereby hope to facilitate the digital analysis of decknamen and the analysis of decknamen in general, also to add computational power to those analyses so we can just be more thorough and take more examples into account, while still providing a method which conforms to the hermeneutics of the humanities. Because oftentimes humanities scholars criticize computer science for, in the end, using black box methods which cannot be verified using humanities hermeneutics. This is a huge problem, and that's why I, as a digital humanities scholar, want to provide a method that is fully transparent, and while it allows for this enhanced and sped up reasoning, it still always allows the users to retrace the steps that the algorithm took, so you can verify for yourself if you concur with these results.